Hi, and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be talking about JavaScript events, so let's waste no time and get to it. Alright, so how are we going to explore events? Well, it's going to be really simple. If you've been following this series for a while, you know that I like to show and tell first and then explain later. So right in front of us here we have the chat application that we built out earlier in this series, and right now you can't really do much with it. It's just static markup and it's not really interactive. So we're going to talk about events in the context of this application. And what I want to do for this first part is to just go ahead and start implementing and show you what events can do. And then we'll do a deep dive later into more specific details of how event works and what they are. So this video is more meant for you to just watch what's happening, absorb the concept, and then we'll go ahead and we'll dive deeper into it later. All right, so don't fret it if you don't get all of the nuances right away. This is just like the warm-up, and then we'll dive deeper into all of the good stuff later. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump into the code now. So I have the code here for the chat application. And if you build this out with me, it should be fairly straightforward, and you should have a good overview of everything that's in here. If not, everything is bootstrapped from this index.js file, and we are just building up all of the elements with just plain vanilla JavaScript using the document object model, right? So that's pretty straightforward, and we've gone through that on this channel before. So if you want to know how that's done, you can go back and watch the previous videos. Anyway, now we are going to go ahead and look how to add some interactivity to our application. So we want to make sure that when a user is clicking on these person or these cards that represents a message, we want to load that message into the view here. And we also want to make sure that we can go ahead and write the message here and hit send. And that's going to trigger an update of the UI as well. Okay. So that's what we're going to use events for. We're going to use them to add interactivity to our application and make sure we can respond to things that are happening on the user's machine, right? So let's go ahead and get started by adding some events that will make sure that we can load these conversations here into the main UI field here. Okay. Okay, so let's jump back into code, and we want to go and head over to our sidebar. And inside of this file, we have a set of contacts. And for each contact, we are creating the contact card, which is the entity that we were looking at the left-hand side here. Each of these content areas here with the name and the image and the text, they are each a contact card that we are rendering out. And what we can do now is we can take this contact card and we can add an event listener on it. So we'll do contact card, add event listener, and we have to specify which event we want to listen on. And in this case, we want to listen to a click event. So what this means is that when we click on the contact card, we want to execute some code, right? And the code we want to execute is going to be inside this callback function here. So this is just defining a function that we want to run when this event triggers, okay? So when we click on a contact card, we want this code to run. So if I hit console log here and we write out clicked, and then we'll go back to our browser, we open up our console, and now when we click on the contact cards, we are able to get a message here in the console. And I'm not sure if you can see that good or well or not, but here we go. So let's go ahead and add the contact ID here. So that's going, wow. Siri is always helpful. Thank you very much. Right, so we have the same event, but now we just altered the console log a little bit, and we want to log out the IDs here. So if we click on the different contact cards now, you can see we get different IDs. And that's important because what we want to do is we want to take that ID and load up the messages. And if you remember, inside of data.js, which is the file that is supplying all of the data for this application, we have the set of contacts here, which have a name, an image URL, and an ID. And then this ID here, which is the ID for the contact, is the key of the messages array, right? So for this message, or these set of messages, I should say, they match this user ID, right? So you can see that is the same. So what we want to do is we want to, when we click on the card, we want to load these this set of messages, right? Okay, so now that we know what we want to do, we have to go ahead and implement it. So I'm just going to head back to the sidebar for a second. And I'm going to create a function here. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be this yet, but I just want to map out the steps that I want to take. So I want to find the ID of the contact and call a function to set the contact ID as the current, let's call it message set. And then this is not going to happen here, but we want to reload the UI so that we get the new messages. So we need a set of functionality that can handle tracking the state and updating the UI. So we have to build that in order to see how this works. But the event is set up and is ready to go. So now we just need to implement the surrounding functionality that we want to happen once we trigger the event, okay? Right, so let's go ahead and build the functionality that we need. We'll head over to index.js and we'll create a app class, and we'll create a constructor that will accept the root L. The root element, this one, is going to be the first argument to our constructor. We'll say this root element equals root L. We'll say this message set ID is going to equal, and that's going to be equal to the first user that we have in our data set. So we have a contacts array here. So we want to import that. So we'll import contacts from data.js, and we'll grab the first contact from that data set, and we'll grab that ID, right? Because in our data set, the ID of the user or the contacts is linked with the message sets, okay? So the message sets have a key or an ID here that we can use to find that message set, and that's linked to the contacts IDs. So when we click on the contacts, we want to grab the ID, and then we're going to use that to find this message set. All right. So back in app or index, we want to create a new function called render, and we'll grab everything that we have here, We'll put that inside of the render function. And now we should be able to do this. And we'll pass in the root element, which we have defined at the top of the file. So that's this one. And now we should be able to do app render, and we should have the same results as before. So hit refresh, and we still have our application. So let's go back to our code and work on the next part. So currently, this message set ID is not being used for anything. But that's going to change in a second. But let's go ahead and tackle the first part of our problem, which is being able to change this message set ID when we click on one of the users in the sidebar. We'll create a new function here called set message set ID. And it'll accept an ID. And we'll say this message set ID equals ID. We'll go ahead and do this root element inner HTML empty string, and we'll do this render. So this will take a parameter ID, so that's going to be a string. We'll set the property of this message set ID equal to that new string. Then we'll reset our application, which means we just basically re-render the whole thing by setting inner HTML to empty string and calling this.render, which will trigger this function here. So now we need a way to get this function into our sidebar code so we can trigger it inside of our event listener, right? So the way we can do that is we can take all of the code here and we'll place that in a function that we call create sidebar. And we'll take all of the code here, including this, and we'll say return sidebar at the end. And inside of here, we'll accept the set message set ID as a parameter. And then we'll export the create sidebar function, right? Now we're exporting function, and that means we can actually pass in parameters, where before we were exporting a finished object. So let's go ahead and take this function here, create sidebar, and we'll import that in index.js. So we'll just swap this to create sidebar. And we'll go ahead and do here, we'll do const sidebar equals create sidebar, and it will accept the function that we created here. Now we're passing in the function to create sidebar, and inside of here we should now have the ability to call the set message ID function from our parent app class. So let's go ahead and go down here, and we'll make sure we call that with the contact.id. So remove the rest of this, and inside of app or index.js, we'll go ahead and make sure we log this message set ID. Right, so let's go to our browser, we'll hit refresh, and we can see that we now have different message set IDs when we click the different cards here in the sidebar. All right, so that's the first part done. Secondly, we need to make sure that we use this property to render the messages. So the way we need to go about this is we need to pass this property into the main content. And it's actually important here as messages from the messages file. So we'll go to this file. We'll go ahead and rename this create messages. And we'll remove the invocation here because we want to have the function available to us. And we'll go up here and we'll change the name of this function, which is the function that was exported previously. So now we need to make sure that we have a parameter here called message set ID. And instead of going about current chat messages current user, we're going to use the message set ID here. And I can see a bug here that I want to fix as well. So if message owner equals current user, that's this. We'll need to go to data.js and just get the current user, because that's the actual user of the application. So if the current user is this, then we want to actually create a user message here, and otherwise we are going to create a contact message. That will make sense now. And then for the chat, that's going to now be retrieved from the message set ID. Okay. So now inside of our render function, we need to make sure that we take the messages here, and we'll rename this create messages, and we'll say const messages equals create messages, which is now a function, and we're passing in this message set ID. Okay, let's check our browser and see what happens when we now click around in our sidebar. We have a event listener that's listening to the click events that we are emitting when we're clicking inside of the browser window. We're grabbing the ID for the user here that's in the sidebar. So the user we are clicking on, we're grabbing that ID, and then we're passing that down to the render function that grabs the correct message set. Okay. So I know that's a lot, and I think for this video we'll stop here just because it's a lot to absorb. But in the next one, we'll go ahead and we'll keep doing events here just to get a little bit more familiar with it. And then at the end, we'll do a deep dive. Okay, so thanks a lot for tuning in. And until next time, have a great day.